basic concepts that you'll use for the sighting and proportion assignment. There are several things that I look for when it comes to grading that assignment, and that I think also go into making a solid drawing. Some of this assignment is loosely based on some concepts in this book, Brian Curtis, 2nd edition. I think that's one of your recommended texts. Drawing from observation. And there's a little assignment here, or a chapter here called biomorphic form. So, you know, if you wanted to somehow reference this book, maybe there's helpful things in this book and also the other recommended book. But the assignment it does have some ties to that, but it also has some links to things that I've been doing since I was in college. So these ideas have been floating around the college drawing realm for a while. I want to give a presentation on the class notes for the sighting and proportion assignment. Like a lot of drawings in our a semester that you've probably seen from me, there's a lot of imagination that comes into play. Like with the perspective assignment, there was a set of rules, but then you kind of had to imagine things and use your memory too about what you knew about those rules to go forward. Well, when we get into drawing real things, that also still comes into play. So when I'm dealing with a sighting and proportion drawing, frequently, you know, what I want to do is think a little bit about perspective. Okay, so I'm going to set up an ellipse here on the ground plane, and so I can bring a center line or a midline. These are called construction lines, and it's helping me think transparently. So even though I might be looking at an object in a photograph, a lot of the photograph is off screen, that doesn't really matter so much for this lecture. Take what we learn here and apply it to things that you can reference. Start thinking transparently. Set up a footprint or a tile or an ellipse on the ground plane for your object and figure out where its midline is, and then figure out how tall it's going to be in your drawing. So right away, even before I draw any objects, I've actually established the proportion of the form. That is, I've said, hey, in my drawing, that thing is going to be this tall. And that's it. You're the artist. You're observing that, probably based on your photograph, and you're saying, hey, in my drawing, this thing I'm drawing is that tall. I measured it, I can relate it to my photograph and to a grid that I'm using. It's this tall, and I'm not going to let it get any taller, and you know how wide it is. And so what you've done is you've kind of established a bounding box for the thing that you're going to draw. And right away, you know you sort of know some of its basic proportion. We want to fine-tune that and start to bring an object into a little more clarity and focus. So I'm going to use this midline to help me balance bigger, more broad forms that I know are symmetrical. Like this object here, you know, I can break that down. And what artists do is we start to see that as kind of a transparent thing. You know, almost like we need to feed that information into a computer, program it in so that we could rebuild it, you know, and print it in 3D, for example. But we're not. We're not feeding this information into a computer. We're going to draw it in a kind of conceptual and theoretical way that allows us to visualize transparency in an object. Well, this is a picture, so it doesn't have an ellipse that's horizontal. this ellipse has a little bit of a tilt, and I have to sort of invent the backside of the ellipse. I'm not seeing part of that picture, but I can imagine it in my mind because I know that it's an elliptical form. So this picture has a composite shape. It is composed of different segments that you can sort of naturally map out. So I've got lines actually drawn on my subject matter here, but you can also do this from invention and from imagination, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But some of the things that you'll see in the photograph actually have some surface mapping or some contour lines that are drawn on an object in marker. So part of this assignment is actually to understand how those lines are behaving in space, because it's really kind of a perspective problem. So I can sketch the map lines that I see on this form, and it can help me define its volume on a two-dimensional surface without any kind of shading or value whatsoever. So we're backtracking just a little bit. This assignment is not necessarily about value, but is still a little bit about some perspective concepts and about how to visualize more complicated forms and objects. And then also, something that I like to do, which is to take something that you're observing and merge or add your own layers of knowledge and skill to the project. So I'm drawing this vase, this picture, but I'm also thinking about it as a kind of wire model or a frame that I can map out. I can measure. It has known proportions, and I'm using lots of different kinds of clues to help me sight this thing. So sighting is about finding your way through a drawing using a lot of different visual clues, not just one thing. Sometimes I'm looking at this place, for example. This is called negative space. So that negative space is a kind of tool. If I get that negative space correct, that is the shape of the airspace around the picture, I have information about the picture and its handle at the same time. So sometimes looking at the little spaces between objects can help give you clues about how to size and shape them in your drawing. So for this assignment, I want you to use some surface mapping. And this surface mapping is this idea that you are dividing this object up in a kind of logical way and putting some mapped lines onto the object that would enable your viewer or enable some kind of machine perhaps to decode it and turn it into a real object. But what we're doing is we're not doing that, we're drawing it in a theoretical way so that we can map it out and we can understand its structures, its proportions, and how it's going to sit inside of the framework of a larger drawing. Some objects have map lines built into them already. Other objects have natural clues about how to shape or size things. But the question always comes up, should I map things that are square or should I map things that are boxes? And the answer is yes. You can and you should map things that have angular kinds of shapes. You can use the rules of perspective to help you draw maps and other internal kinds of structure lines on something square and angular. This lantern is a good example of something that has a map line or that has surface mapping already built in. So when I have an object that has a lot of map lines already embedded in its form, I don't necessarily need to add more surface mapping to it in a drawing. But an object that was more blank or that doesn't have a surface map clearly embedded in it, you would want to put that map in to your drawing. And I'm asking you to do something kind of creative and where some of the final outcome or the look of the drawing is a little bit open-ended, a little bit up in the air. You can sort of pick and choose finally, how much surface map to include in your piece or how much to leave out. But what I'm asking you to do is not rush into filling this drawing in with value, but to spend some time working on the structure of the objects, getting their proportion correct before you shade things in. And part of the assignment, part of the rubric for this project is that I want you to have some surface mapping lines. Surface mapping. That's what I call these contour lines. Contours, but the surface mapping is an imaginary thing that the artist needs to be able to do in order to invent shapes and to draw things in 3 dimensions with a little bit more confidence. So if I can draw the outlines of something and then start to find the insides of this object, I can also try to figure out imaginary lines or surface mapping lines that help me convince the viewer about the directions and the angles and the structures that I'm trying to represent. And you can see, it might take a little bit of some editing and some revising to bring all of these angles into the sort of correct sense that they're receding using the vanishing points correctly. My strategy here is that using multiple lines is better than using a single line for these bars. So I'm trying to use at least 2 lines or more for each bar on the lantern. As I work on it, I may need to use my eraser to nudge or move things over here or there. Surface mapping. What else am I going to be looking for in this kind of drawing? Measuring lines. That means horizontal and vertical. Horizontal and vertical lines that you use to find the overall proportion of something, or to figure out something that is relating, an object is relating to across the paper even. Horizontal and vertical lines help you measure and plot stuff out more accurately. Symmetry lines. It's helpful to know where the base of something is. Where can we find the middle of the footprint? Some objects are going to be much more symmetrical than others. Other things are going to be using perspective, and they're not going to be perfectly symmetrical. And some things will be almost symmetrical, like a vase with a handle has symmetry from some angles, but not from other views. So symmetry lines and midlines, transparency. So when I'm drawing things, I want to think about the footprint. I want to be able to envision what would the object look like all the way through it. Sometimes that helps me balance things out or get the angles and the perspective correct, is if I can envision something in 3D or as if it was transparent. Then I might have a better chance of drawing it more accurately. Sighting often talks about sighting angles. That means that when we're looking at something in a photograph, oftentimes if our conditions are correct, the angle that I see here, you can see what I'm doing. This is a common artist thing. I'll hold my pencil up and I'll measure an angle on something I'm drawing. The angle that I measure here becomes the angle that I draw here. So the angle that I see here should be pretty similar in a sense to the angle that I draw here. And the more skilled you get and the more experience you get, the closer you can get at sort of nudging these things around till they come into proportion, and the proportions can continue to be refined. Proportion means, the parts of the object look correct. And when you assemble all the parts of the object, the total of the object also looks correct. So proportion means you're getting all the little parts right size, right shape, right emphasis, right accent, right angle, all that stuff. And then when you back up, it also means that the total view of your form also looks correct. So proportion is about getting the relative sizes and shapes of your objects to appear correctly in your drawing. Proportion also starts very simply and very early on at just saying, here, this is how wide something is, and this is how tall something is. Final things that I'll start to look for are cast shadows, lines of separation, and highlights even. And I'll try to relate these components, these lighting components, to the map on the object. So if I start to look for a shadow, say on this lantern, I can actually start to observe it here in my photograph, and I can look at it and I can project a cast shadow. So I'm also looking for the relationship between the object and its cast shadow. So that should also be something that you just outline with a very similar kind of pressure and weight and look to the way that you're drawing the real object. So I'm saying that cast shadows have a sharp edge. Cast shadows have a sharp edge. And you should outline them. With some practice, you'll learn not to outline them too hard. You do have to change that outline a little bit to develop it further in the drawing, but at first it's just good drawing kind of habit. When you notice a cast shadow because of the rim core, you can outline that thing. I'm talking about shadows, but I'm not coloring anything in. at this point. I'm talking mostly about just outlining the shape, the outer edge of the cast shadow. Look at your photograph here, and you can look at your drawing and your object in your drawing and try to relate those two images and try to get the shadow to sit on your paper and look like it's the right size and right shape, and have a convincing sense of projection and geometry. Now, when you have a complicated thing like a vase or a pitcher, you might have some shadows that are occurring up higher on the object. These are cast shadows, so there's a cast shadow from this rim that's being projected or being cast down onto the body of the pitcher, and I'm kind of simplifying it a little bit, cleaning it up a little bit, but I'm using the surface map to help me figure out how to shape this shadow system here. Here's another thing that I want to start to look for. This is the line of separation on this form. This is where that top plane starts to turn to side plane or under plane, and all the way across the front middle of this vase, below this line, we would start to mask that in as an underplane. So you can see it here. It's kind of maybe a little tricky sometimes with the surface mapping lines on there, because oftentimes the surface lines or the surface mapping lines are going to correlate pretty closely to that line of separation. And oftentimes you're naturally going to have a plane change or a wide point on something, and that's going to be what is in part probably causing a lot of the shadow shape to appear as it does. Piecing together components of light and shadow, and once I have things mapped out and I have some surface mapping on there and I understand my planes, if I wanted to refer back to some of the stuff that was happening here in this lesson, I could start to assign some values to these forms as well. So things that are facing down or that have cast shadow on them, I could start to mask those in. And you can see that even just a little bit of my light color, my side plane color, starts to help to define that object, and it's going to allow you the ability to add more layers here and to ultimately start to model and create more realistic lighting effects. So the question is though, how much of the surface mapping line transparency should I leave? I want to see a little bit. I think it's kind of cool. I don't want you to focus too much on shading. I want there to be a layered look that involves a lot of creativity or problem solving, that you know, you don't know exactly what these objects are supposed to look like. You're approaching the drawing with a little bit of open-ended quality. I'm not looking for a fully rendered drawing, and again I would refer you back to some of this sections in this book for an assignment like that, and say, hey, you know, these drawings are not fully, this has some surface mapping on there, these drawings are not fully shaded and fully rendered, but they still feel very structural, very three-dimensional. And so that's what we're looking at here. This author, Brian Curtis, is calling it biomorphic form. And I'm using some ideas about perspective to help me structure and build things, but I'm stopping short of doing a lot of heavy-duty shading on these things. My work is not exactly like this, but it is kind of maybe has relation there. I'm also asking you to do other things, like get the objects in an arrangement that is also makes sense in space. And I'm also asking you to draw outlines and to start to work on some of the shapes of your cast shadows in your drawing. Now I'm not going to color in this cast shadow too dark, but if I do mass in or hatch in 50%, the way you get 50% is just press harder. You know, it's just like playing an instrument. You have different notes to hit. So sometimes you're pressing to the 25% value, other times you're massing or hatching to your 50% value. And then the other thing I'm doing is I come back and work on these cores. I tune up the edge of that shadow because that's a rim core. That helps me focus the light and clean up the look of the drawing, and I'm focusing in on the sit core down here, which is the underline of the object. So all that stuff is coming together to help create quickly a fairly three-dimensional tone in drawing. Final note about surface mapping and proportions. Drawing objects like this, again, you want to use transparency. We're trying to get the overall structure of something. So if I'm trying to draw a complicated object like this column back here, I need to think about it with a number of different kinds of different philosophies about how to build it. The first thing I want to do is establish its total height in relation to where I want it on the paper. I'm going to find where I want it to end and where I want, you know, the top of it to be. So bottom and top. I just say, hey, in my drawing, this thing isn't going to get any bigger than what I establish here. The common problem beginners have is, you know, not being able to set up this bounding area, and then they start drawing something and the bounding box you know, moves. So we have to get these kinds of skills that say, hey, I'm going to draw this thing and I'm going to scale it so that it fits into this sort of predetermined area. A lot of objects can be divided in half. So one thing we often do when we're looking at proportion is we say, well, where's halfway? I can measure something. I could use a ruler, or there's another way to measure something halfway. You can use the point of your pencil and your thumb, and you can use this little bit of length right here to measure. It's the same thing as using a ruler. So I could measure the total height of that column. It's about 4 inches or so. Let's say it's a little under 4 inches. So I could divide, you know, 4 in half, and I could figure out, well, what's happening in this column at about halfway. And what you could do is you could then put a halfway mark here, and you could put a little halfway mark on a column, and then you could start to draw everything that exists above the halfway, and then you could sort of teach your brain or whatever to draw everything that exists below the halfway. So just breaking the column in half would help you decode it perhaps a little bit easier. So that's one thing artists often look for is halfway. But other times you might think, well, maybe halfway, there's not really much happening there at halfway. So another division that makes sense is the third. And this is another common proportional measurement that artists use a lot is thirds. So if I divide my bounding box up into thirds instead of halfway, I actually see there's more landmarks and more things occurring on the thirds in this particular piece. Be flexible. Sometimes you might want to have proportional measurements on the half. Other times proportional measurements on the third, what you need for best accuracy. And there's a lot of stuff like that when you get into life drawing the body. Sometimes measure halfway, sometimes measure a third and see what's happening on your thirds. Well, what is happening on my thirds? Well, what I've seen over time, I've drawn this thing a few times, is that this sort of egg shape sits in the center third, and that the top and bottom of the column sit pretty much inside of the other 2/3 of that form. There's some rings, there's some donuts here that I need to count and structure, but what you can see is that, you know, we've already sort of established, I guess, the kind of some of these bigger chunks of that thing. We're honing in on its proportion, getting the parts of it to be the right size and right shape, and also when you back up the totality of it to become the right size and right shape. So we talked about using a symmetry line or a midline, so I'll go ahead and put one of those in there. A little bit tricky here, I've got some perspective on these blocks, so I'll need to maybe use my eraser to nudge some of these edges around and start to squeeze in a second little piece, or a back piece here. Pretty common thing, you know, with draw the sort of profile of the front, understand what that's going to look like, and then you can add another, you know, add some depth by just put a little slice or a little something back there on the side where you see some depth. Okay, we know about vanishing points and about parallel lines, and we can make some assumptions that the block on top is in alignment with the block on the bottom, so I can kind of move upward here and think about drawing some of those parts of the block up here too. Put some depth on it by adding a little piece back there, that side piece, that depth piece, that turning plane. And you know, if you're measuring carefully, you actually would see that all of these lines are receding to the same vanishing point, because there's a lot of stuff that's parallel in architecture. A lot of sets of parallel lines, blocks, and other ellipses that need to function as if they, you know, are drawn in the correct perspective. Alright, well, so there's going to block that in, and what my strategy is here is just to count. I say, well, how many rings, how many donuts here do you see? I see 1, 2, 3 main forms or bumps on the edge. So I'll come over here and I'll kind of try to figure out, you know, where do I need to start to blend that shape of that egg outward, always falling back or using on this midline here to help me structure these transitions, these blends between curves. But I need 3 bumps, so I'm just going to sketch them in and not going to worry about it. 1, 2, 3. Fits pretty good. They are not right, but I have estimated what they ought to look like. You know, it's better than it used to be. So I'm chipping away at it. 1, 2, 3. Now I want to go back and I have to think about what does an ellipse look like and how it's parallel and perpendicular to the edges of my paper. All of these bumps are showing different structures or different plane changes that are going to occur, not just on the outline of the object, because as I've said, the outline is where it all ends. The good stuff, the really important information, is happening in the front middle, in the center of this form. So all of these bumps need to also be reflected, or also need to be expressed that there is a line or multiple lines, in fact, swinging across the front middle of those rings. And I have to control the angle and the pitch of this line so that it is thinking about, you know, getting wider as it's going down away from my eye level. And you know, I can use my eraser and I can nudge stuff around as I sketch in just by changing my line quality and my line pressure. It's fairly intuitive, but that's my secret. First I'm going to break it down into thirds, and then I'll just count the number of bumps here on the edge to figure out how to structure all of those various cuts on the form. Here's 2 bumps, and I echo that across the form, and then start to swing some broad horizontal strokes all the way across the front, middle of the object, and making edits and changes as I go, pinching in the skinny parts as I draw. So that's where you actually want to push harder on your outline. Another artist secret here is where you want to outline stronger is where the object is pushing under or squeezing in. So where that form is squeezing in, call this a dynamic, but we also sometimes call this dark emphasis here a closure. So it's hard to convey, but I'm actually pushing quite hard on these closures, on these dynamics, and it's a little bit slow. It takes a while to build them up and to get that dark accent to pop out. But I'm concentrating on my skinny parts. Seems kind of weird and counterintuitive at first, but the parts that are indented the most oftentimes require the most line quality, the darkest line. And I think it's because, those indented places are getting the least amount of light. So you can press harder on them. Once you get the pattern, the formula of establishing closures in the skinny parts, you can bring stuff into focus with a little more confidence, because you're not putting big, thick, dark outlines all around everything, but you have a much more responsive dynamic line that pulses, that moves and flows, and start to more accurately describe something that you are observing. Well, after you have something complicated like that drawn, you could still go even a little bit further and map this thing out. And once you start to map out some of these other objects in your picture, you might choose to practice this mapping. I'd like to see students put the mapping on everything, even if it's doesn't exist there. So I have to use a little bit of imagination and logic, empirical type thinking to help me draw a surface map on this object. The first thing I want to draw is a map that goes down the middle. It's going to start in the middle of the block, but then it pushes back into the object itself, and I have to make a line. What's happening is there's a line that's basically going straight up and down through here, but it's pulsing. That line isn't just a flat line, there's a dynamic line that's being used to map the surface. So where the object is pushing under, that map line is going to get darker, and where the object is more full, the map line gets thinner, and where it pushes under again, you put another dynamic, and all that can happen. Little pulses of line or dynamic happen even on a straight line. Put a little bit of shading on the line to show its plane changes. Go darker on the map line where the map is pushing under. You could imagine you're like an ant or some other thing like that was crawling or mapping the surface. You had to figure out the topography by going slowly and feeling your way across the surface of the form. So too much mapping can look a little bit chaotic in a drawing, but not enough looks blank and undefined and uninformed, and also like you're not following the rules of the project. So the artistic aspect of this drawing, the creative aspect of this drawing, comes with how will you map out these objects, how do you project your light and shadow. Everybody's got to find their own sort of unique balance or look about when this particular drawing is done. Some students, maybe with more experience, will be able to carry the surface textures of the objects farther, but I'm not asking for that. This is a much more, again, we're still early in the semester. This is kind of a theoretical, conceptual drawing. that's asking you to think about objects in a kind of structural way that's based also on the rules of perspective and about also somehow slightly connected to some of the examples presented in this book on biomorphic form. When I fill something like this in, I want to use hatching. You could plot the shadows on something like this as well by using a little bit of logic, a little bit of observation here, a little bit of some empirical thinking to help you piece together the shadow system on something complicated like this. When I look at this, I see a series or sequence of lights and darks that are occurring down the face of this object. What I want to do is, because a lot of those are cast shadows, I can outline them. So I'm going to start to outline some of the edges of the shadows or the shapes of light that I'm seeing. And when I'm outlining stuff, what I'm doing is actually starting to create planes or facets, closed shapes that are going to allow me to understand where to shade, where to put the values in to bring out the structure of this form even a little more clearly. So what I'm doing again is I'm just looking at what is a cast shadow, what is an underplane inside of these ins and outs here. Sometimes it's easier to see than others. Okay, here's a line of separation. So as that hits that wide point and those planes are facing downward, that's usually where the light and shadow are going to separate or are going to break apart. Can expect to see some kind of cast shadow sitting here on top of this ring. Moving down, here's another shadow system here. There's another one here at the base, and then I'm down and I will push cast shadow back in space. I can't really see it in my photographs, so I'm just kind of inventing a sort of squarish shadow I think would be appropriate for this column. So I'm just going to go back. I'm going to use this little prism strategy, this plane massing in plane strategy that we worked out on the last video. Take that little object, apply it to some broader principles here. So I'll start with my side planes. I'm going to mass in anything that's not facing straight up. And I'm also going to mass in things that are facing under or that are in shadow. So I'm just varying my pressure depending on if it's a shadow, if it's an underplane, if it's a top plane, and it's fairly responsive. But once you start to get some value blocked in, you get it in the right place, get it at the right darkness, get some of the sharp and soft qualities right, and you start to see that form come into even more focus. Again, I'm not trying to spend a lot of time on this. I'm trying to show you a technique or an approach that actually is fairly efficient and quick. It doesn't really involve a lot of rendering or blending. I'm just applying a couple of basic principles here to things that are getting a little bit more complicated. There's a cast shadow, pressurizing a little more where there's an indent, sit cores, rim cores. So where we have cores, that's where you start to stroke harder, press more, or push in indents. There are I think it's kind of, there's a lot of little tricks, a lot of little formulas almost, that allow me to move through the drawing of a shape like this. Don't rush into shading or filling in your colors. I think it's more for those students who are getting through all the other phases, all these things that are basically linear elements, and the massing, which is something we did in last project, is actually kind of a secondary concern right now. And I don't want you to rush into that. This drawing, we're taking a little bit of a step backward and not racing to shade stuff in. Still want to use a very heavy dose of theory, being able to imagine things transparently in 3D. Even if we can't see the whole object, we should be able to understand how to draw something where we might be missing a piece of it, or the object is opaque, but you can still imagine how the back side of the object is formed. And those are very powerful skills for your imagination. And then also when you get into drawing stuff from reality, if you understand, you can predict how these things are going to look even more clearly.